Now you see I'm disorientated. This is my computer. Here we go. I want us to go back to our precious scripture that we have spent time meditating on through the lens of these 5 women that we've been on our journey with. And again, this evening we're going to look at a theme, this extraordinary idea of justice. And for Josephine Butler, justice was not an idea. He was a person, the Lord Jesus. And I just want to set that out at the front end of our conversation so we can feel our way to understanding the centre of Josephine Butler's life and her thought. I need to do a quick experiment that is not intended as intimidation, but this is for the sake of my own bookwork. Before we started the Lent course, had everybody heard of Josephine Butler? How many people had heard of Josephine Butler? Okay, that confirms my basic statistical analysis when it comes to Josephine Butler. In 1927, Millicent Fawcett, the famous leader of the suffragists, the sort of iconic front figurehead of the women's movement, called Josephine Butler the most distinguished woman of the 19th century. So it is somewhat surprising that most of us, and that's been true wherever I've talked about Josephine Butler, we've never heard of her. History has this extraordinary habit, doesn't it, of remembering certain kinds of leaders and leaving other leaders in the shadows. They fall from the pages of history. Now, for the first few generations after Josephine's death, actually pretty much for 1.5 generations, she died in 1906, everybody involved in the women's movement, across the board, whether they were on one end of the political spectrum or the other, looked to Josephine Butler as the mother of modern ideological feminism, even though they didn't invent that term until 1894. And Josephine Butler had this extraordinary centrality to the British women's movement, and then abruptly, at the end of the interwar period, just as war broke out for the second time in Europe, Josephine Butler fell off the pages of history. And it's a curious thing. When, in the late 20th century, historians busied themselves trying to write the history of feminism and the history of the women's movement, they found Josephine Butler just a little bit outside the box of the story they were trying to tell. Because the truth is, Josephine Butler was a little bit too Christian for second-wave feminists. But she was also just a little too radical, perhaps a little too feminist, though I don't actually like using that word of her, for Christian history books as well. So she didn't make it onto the pages of those books either. And I grew up in a family where William Wilberforce was the quintessential Christian hero. I imbibed his importance from early childhood, being told the stories of the abolition campaign. So you can imagine my amazement when I was halfway through my doctoral work and I realised how significant Josephine Butler was to the history of the late 19th century, and then to find that she came from the very Christian tradition that I had come from, and I'd never heard of her, and I felt really shortchanged. I felt as though I had been robbed of a friend. And I've wanted to learn more about Josephine Butler ever since those days of busily working away on my doctoral work. And it's only been in the last 3 years that I've had the opportunity to do some really deep dive work on her life. And my goodness, what a privilege that has been, of finding a friend, someone who has helped me to walk the walk of faith in my own life. And all I want to do this evening is tell you a bit about Josephine Butler, but also tell you, as well as telling you about her, tell you about some of the ways in which this extraordinary woman has impacted my own life. She's known for her action. It's easier to write about what people do than it is to write about who they are. It's easier to write about the events of history than the faith that people nurture in their interior life. Those two things are different, and as we'll see with Josephine Butler, they overlap in some extraordinary ways. She's known for her action. She's known for the way that she addressed the problem of human trafficking, how she led the campaign to repeal the contagious diseases legislation, campaign that lasted 16 years from 1869 through until 1886. She was formative in the passing of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, which is the quintessential piece of legislation that protected minors and women from sexual violence and trafficking and raised the age of consent to 16, where it is today, from the age of 12. She's known for her extraordinary work amongst women involved in prostitution in the Victorian period. She's known for helping women get out of the sex trade, a trade which is much easier to get into than it is to get out of, to find alternative forms of employment, and to find ways of integrating back into society in a moment in history where if a woman was sexually compromised, there was no way back. Unlike the respectability that men who availed themselves of the services of prostitutes somehow managed to maintain. There was an unequal standard of morality in Victorian culture. And Josephine Butler is known most for her startling address of the sexual double standard contained within the Contagious Diseases Act. And I'll tell you about them in a minute, but I want to walk us through her life with some chronology. Now, I do need to be really careful here because I get very excited about this stuff. And I can't believe that even though I've been working on footnotes about Josephine Butler since 5 o'clock this morning, as soon as I start talking about her, it's like an energy is sort of like a fountain bubbling up inside me. I feel so excited to be able to talk about this woman because I think she's extraordinary. At the center of this woman's life was a deep, sustaining and intimate relationship with Jesus Christ. She lived a life of public leadership and political action immersed in prayer. A life rich in intimate relationship with God. And prayer emerges in her writings as the center not only of her devotional life, not only as a motivation for her action, but also as her political philosophy, as her way of understanding the primary way in which human beings get to participate with God in molding the course of human history. The way in which human beings get to shape their society. And she understood her vocation. I'm kind of going to the middle of her life in order to work back out, but she understood her vocation as an act of intercession and entering in to relationship with outcast women. So, how did this begin in her life? She grew up in Northumberland. She was the niece of Earl Grey, as in Earl Grey tea. She was from a political family. Her father was a senior land agent for the Greenwich Hospital Lands Estates on the northern borders of England. That was an extraordinarily responsible position. He literally managed the land all the way from Carlisle to Hexham, all the way across the whole of that northern section of Northumbria, an important strategic outpost when it came to the relationship between Scotland and England. So he was a very important figure. But he too was a man of faith. He was a friend of Thomas Clarkson and other members of the Clapham sect, an associate of William Wilberforce, and he was very involved, John Gray, in the abolition campaign, which of course ended in 1833 with the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, an act that was passed under Earl Grey, Lord Grey's administration. So Josephine Butler grew up in a political home, in a home where politics and Christian faith were very closely interwoven. But later on in her life, even though her parents were Anglicans and she married an Anglican clergyman, when she was asked where she understood her spiritual roots to lie, she identifies them in the revival traditions of the Wesleyan Church. Some of the traditions that we were talking about with Susanna Wesley last week. And she has a vivid memory of riding on the back of a cart, sitting on bales of straw across the Cheviot Hills in Northumberland to revival meetings for prayer and worship, where farmers from the outposts of Northumbria would travel miles on horseback in order to hear the preaching of some extraordinary preachers like Edward Irving, who came up to Northumberland in the 1840s, 1830s. So Josephine Butler went to these meetings, not with her parents, but with the nurse, the Gray family nurse. And she has an extraordinary memory of a woman who was known in their family simply as Dear Old Jane. She actually did have a name, Jane Cranston, but we know almost nothing about this woman. She spent her life devoted to supporting John and Hannah Gray in raising their children, of which Josephine was the seventh of 9. And this nurse was a woman who spent her life immersed in prayer. And there's an extraordinary description that Josephine gives us of this nurse, living in constant communion with God. And this had a profound impact on Josephine. And she sees her spiritual history lying in the tradition of the family nurse. When she was in her teens, she had a kind of crisis, not of faith, I think, but of love. Because she knew that if she was going to follow her parents' faith, she needed it to be her own. She couldn't inherit somebody else's faith secondhand, as she writes. And we have amazing descriptions of her from her journals, going out onto the hills of Northumberland, and day and sometimes night, learning to wrestle in prayer. And she spent time in what she calls dogged determination, teaching herself the disciplined life of prayer. And she describes prayer as wrestling with God. She uses that famous story of Jacob in the Bible when he wrestled with God. And she draws on that biblical language to talk about her own life of prayer. And even as a 17-year-old, she was wrestling with the injustices in the world. And she remembers her father reading from the book of Isaiah about loosing the chains of injustice, about God coming to the poor. And it had this indelible effect on her, and she had a profound sense of justice and injustice and the need to pray and wrestle to see justice done. So her spiritual history in her life is long and deep. She marries a wonderful man in 1852. He's a classics tutor from Exeter College in Oxford. She met him in Durham. He's also a man of faith. He shares Josephine Butler's faith very much so. And when they were married in 1852, they set up home together on the High Street in Oxford. I'm going to read you a little bit because I think you can hear her voice when you hear her language. This is from her journal in Oxford, probably around 1856. I had been sitting for some time at my open window to breathe the air, and it seemed to me I heard a wailing cry somewhere among the trees in the twilight. It was a woman's cry, a woman aspiring to heaven and dragged back to hell, and my heart was pierced with pain. The slight summer breeze and those tall trees held in them a whisper of the future, but when the day dawned, it seemed to me again more painful than ever. The great high wall of prejudice, built on a foundation of lies, which surrounded a whole world of sorrows, griefs, injustices and crimes which must not be spoken of. I read you that because these phrases they run right through the Butler corpus. In all her writing, these phrases recur. She's describing the experience of a circus girl who ran away from her life of enslavement because she was also a sexual slave to the men at the circus and anybody they choose to farm her out to. She ran away, and Josephine probably met her at Magdalen, in Magdalen Parish Church on St. Giles. And then she was recaptured by the party in the circus. And it had a profound effect on Josephine as she began in Oxford, a place of great privilege, to see an underside to the city. She started to work with a woman called Felicia Skene, and she began to visit the underlife of Oxford. This city where clergymen were training, a largely celibate environment, and yet hundreds and hundreds of women, many of them young girls, brought to the city to feed the sexual appetites of this theoretically celibate community. And Josephine Butler begins to see the hypocrisy, the double standards, and it sickens her. She reads the novel by Elizabeth Gaskell, Ruth. It comes out into the bookshops in 1854, and she reads this novel avidly, and Ruth is an iconic figure, in many ways a very typical story, a moral tale of a woman who's seduced by her lover and then abandoned and thrown from her workplace without a reference, destitute and impoverished with no way back. But Gaskell puts a different twist on her story of Ruth, because Ruth is a woman of great dignity and deep spirituality. Josephine Butler loves the book. She goes to the next Oxford dinner party, excited to discuss the book, and sits on listening while the learned men of the city, in the days when academics had time to read novels, rip this book to shreds and pour scorn on it and epitomise the very same attitudes and assumptions and double standards that Elizabeth Gaskell has fictionalised in her novel. Josephine Butler's appalled. And what she sees is the young woman who's been seduced by one of the men pontificating on Gaskell's novel, who's thrown into Newgate jail in London when she carries his child and then kills the child at birth and is indicted of infanticide. Josephine begins to get involved in very complex lives. This woman from an extraordinarily beautiful and in many ways with rarefied and slightly untainted early life. She starts to see the injustices of her culture, and it changes her. She becomes withdrawn and depressed. They leave Oxford under a rather black cloud. And I want us to flip forward in time to 1866. We're going to go forward and then we're going to go backwards a step. 1866. The family have moved from Oxford, first to Cheltenham, and they've gone on up to Liverpool. And the next scene I want to read to you is set on a damp stone floor in a vast workhouse with 4,000 inmates, the poorest members of Liverpool society. And this scene is set on the bare cellar floor underneath the workhouse in the oakum sheds. And here, women, most of them involved in penny prostitution, would seek shelter for a night whilst picking oakum, picking the fibres in old ropes so they could use them for caulking in the great ships that found their way out of the former slave port of Liverpool. Now listen to what Josephine writes. I went down to the oakum sheds and begged admission. I was taken into an immense, gloomy vault filled with women and girls, more than 200 at that time. I sat on the floor among them and picked oakum. They laughed at me and told me my fingers were no use for that work, which was true. But while we laughed, we became friends. Now, what these women she's busy making friends with did not know was Josephine at that time was in her own hell of grief. And it was actually grief that drove her to the oakum shed in the first place. 2 years before that scene, in August 1864, the butler's only daughter, the family were living in Cheltenham, they'd moved there from Oxford, their only daughter, they had 3 sons, but their daughter Eva fell from the banisters in the butler's family home, 40 feet onto the tiled hallway below. She lived several hours, but every attempt that they made to save her failed, and she died in horrendous pain in George Butler's arms. Josephine Butler found it almost impossible to write or speak about this terrible tragedy for many, many years. It actually took her 25 years. And at that point she then wrote, "Never can I lose that memory. The fall, the sudden cry, and then the silence. She was our only daughter, the light and joy of our lives." And for 2 years, Butler wrestled with dark, dark grief, despair at times. And this experience of grief, it's like a baptism when you're reading her work. It's as though you go into a baptism of grief with her. Who can write the rationale of grief? And who can explain its mysteries, its apparent inconsistencies and unreasonableness, its weakness and its strength? I suffered much during the first months in our new home in Liverpool. I only knew that when my heart ached night and day, the only solace would seem to be to find other hearts that ached night and day with more reason than mine. I had no clear idea beyond that, no plan for helping others. My sole wish was to plunge into the heart of some human misery and say, as I then knew I could, to afflicted people, I understand. I too have suffered. It's such a powerful move. What happens to Josephine in those 2 years of grieving is her grief begins to turn her not inwards, but outwards to connect with the grief of other people. She writes about the hazards of grief. She writes about grief having the potential to gnarl the human spirit, to bend a person in on themselves, and to swallow up all their life. She also writes about the potential of human suffering to enable a person in the midst of their grief to fellowship with the man of sorrows, the one who took our griefs. And in that experience of fellowship with Christ, to be able to fellowship with others who also grieve. And it's an extraordinary movement that Josephine Butler makes in these 2 years. And it connects her with women from totally different social backgrounds, completely different experiences of life. And yet, their common experience of sorrow and grief broke through the barriers. And Josephine made friends. She began to invite some of the women who were too ill to continue to work to live in the home with them. Let me just read you another example. She starts to teach these women to pray. I proposed that they should learn a few verses to say to me on my next visit. I recollect a tall, dark, handsome girl standing up in our midst among the damp refuse and lumps of tarred rope and repeating the words of Jesus. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give unto you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. And we listened in perfect silence. This audience, wretched, bedraggled, ignorant criminals some, and wild and defiant others. I said, let's kneel down and cry to that same Jesus who spoke these words. And down on their knees they fell, every one of them, reverently on that damp stone floor. Some saying the words after me, others moaning and weeping. It was a strange sound, that united wail, continuous, pitiful, strong, like a great sigh or murmur of vague desire and hope, issuing from the heart of despair, piercing the gloom and murky atmosphere of that vaulted room and reaching to the heart of God. I'm reining myself in because there's just so many things to say about that one piece of text. But does it give you a sense here of prayer, of the way in which these women from totally different backgrounds are coming together as friends to call on Jesus? And Josephine begins to teach the women that the place where they will find justice is in the one who is just, Christ. And she starts to teach women to pray. And she talks about prayer as the anguish cry. There's so much more to say about that, but I need to keep telling you a little bit about her story and not tell you everything about what I'm going to write about in my book, because I want you to read it. Now, every leader in their life who's serious, I think, about following Jesus has an Esther moment. Do you know what I mean by that? Queen Esther, for such a time as this, you have brought me into the royal court. You remember that story? How Queen Esther is in a harem, not a great place for a woman. And yet somehow she sees God having taken her to a place for a particular time in order to do a particular thing. And while Josephine Butler is working with women on the streets in Liverpool, setting up houses of rest for them, which we can talk more about if anybody wants to, the government passed the contagious diseases legislation. That piece of legislation, 3 acts, 1864, 1867, 1869, they were passed to deal with the rapid spread of venereal disease in the armed forces of Britain. And at a time when you're trying to build an empire, your armed forces are rather significant. And there was a massive outbreak, as they discovered during the Crimean War in the middle of the 1850s, of venereal disease amongst the armed forces, and it was compromising the efficiency of Britain's fighting force. So the government felt compelled to act, and they brought in the legislation to do something to stop the spread. And under the terms of the act, any woman residing in designated garrison towns and ports and suspected of prostitution could be detained by a plainclothes undercover policeman and taken before a magistrate and then subjected to fortnightly medical examinations. And if a woman was found to be suffering from gonorrhea or syphilis, she could be in turn incarcerated in so-called lock hospital. And she could stay there for a period in the first act of 3 months, in the second act of 9 months, and then in the third act of a period of up to a year, until she was clean from disease, and then she'd be given a certificate, a government bona fide certificate, to prove she was clean, so she could go back and continue her work amongst the men with confidence that this woman would now not contaminate the men. So the women had to have a compulsory examination. If they refused to have the examination, they would be sent to prison, sometimes also with hard labour. And this act, most insidiously and problematically, involved absolutely no requirement for men to have any form of examination for the disease. So it contained within it an injustice. Opposition to the acts didn't really start until they were extended to the north of England in 1869. And we hear about those acts in Josephine Butler's writings through the eyes of her friends. These are not just impersonal pieces of government legislation. They are acts which place all women suspected of prostitution into a great lumping category of common prostitute, and then herd them, having suspended habeas corpus and all their rights to evidence and trial, into an examination which many people, including Josephine Butler, described as steel rape. Butler was asked to lead a small ladies' national association to front the campaign to repeal those Contagious Diseases Acts. 14 women when they started out in 1869, at which point Josephine Butler was in many ways at the height of her career, taking on this particular issue, identifying herself with the cause of prostitutes, whom she refused to call prostitutes and named instead outcast women, to shine light on those who were doing the outcasting. To take that case on was to step beyond the pale. There was no way back into respectable society for the Butler family when Josephine took that on. It took 16 years, during which time she was pelted with excrement, she was physically assaulted at one occasion. It took 14 bodyguards to prevent mobbing. She was subject to 4 different arson attacks. She had death threats on a repeated basis. There were people in great power who knew perfectly well that Josephine, in her work with individual women, had evidence that they would rather keep in the dark. And they included parliamentarians and senior churchmen as well. So Josephine Butler was a woman of great power, but what is remembered about her most as she travelled to Crewe and to Birmingham and to Stockport and to northern cities and southern cities alike, standing up and talking about politics in public, unprecedented. But she wasn't just talking about politics in public, she was talking about sex in public. It was shocking. But the thing that everybody talks about when this woman spoke was her profound sorrow and quietness. Those are the 2 qualities that are pulled out over and over again. She was a woman of great gentleness, in marked incongruity with the subject matter that this woman was dealing with. And this extraordinary sorrow drew people to her. And over those 16 years, a phenomenal movement of prayer developed across the country, uniting members of the working classes, men and women, with churchmen and churchwomen from every denominational, in extraordinary communities of practice, where people came together in their local community to pray for women on the margins, and then to engage whilst they prayed in setting up legal representation for women, finding them employment positions, writing letters to one another and saying, have you got a position for a domestic servant? Passing on used clothes so that women could actually wear clothes beyond the clothes that they were forced to wear in brothels. Often women's clothing was taken away from them so that they had no garments to appear in public apart from the garments of the prostitute. So there were many ways in which these communities were practically engaged as well as spiritually engaged with these women's lives. And again, there's so much to say. And I want to tell you a little of the end of the story, just enough so that you know the story arc. By the end of the 1870s, through these extraordinary communities of practice, which began to extend not just through the British Isles, but across continental Europe as well, it became clear that there was a highly sophisticated, extremely lucrative and very well organised traffic in girls as young as 9 and 12 who were shipped from London, bought in London for a sum of around £5, shipped to the brothels of Brussels and Paris, where they were sold on for a highly inflated price. And Josephine Butler was involved, along with many of her colleagues. She did not act alone in bringing to light this extraordinary and deeply evil trade, and beginning to protect children, very vulnerable children, against sexual exploitation. When, with the age of consent as low as 12, there was a very strong market for English girls between the ages of 12 and 15, because on the continent the laws had age of consent slightly higher than they did in Britain. So that was a lucrative trade, and Butler was involved in bringing it to light, bringing it out into the open, which was both a dangerous act and a highly inflammatory act from a political perspective. That involved her, I'm cutting a very long and extremely dramatic story short, that culminated in the passing of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, which raises the age of consent. But by the time that act was passed and the contagious diseases legislation was finally repealed a year later in 1886, behind this cause had built this extraordinary tide and momentum for change in the culture. Not just for women on the margins, actually for all women of every social class. And that movement that builds behind the Contagious Diseases Acts, that started out with 14 women working for women on the margins, moves into a full movement for seeking the equal constitutional rights for men and women. That's the piece of the story in the history of the women's movement that is cleverly edited out of the secular history books. It was a movement rooted in prayer and the pursuit of justice, rooted in the text of Scripture, where Josephine anchored her prayer life in meditations on the person of Christ. And she looks at the stories of the Gospels and looks at the encounters that Jesus has with women and argues every one of those encounters led to liberation. And she finds in the text of Scripture, it's actually not easy to find it anywhere else in historic writings, it is a biblical idea, that men and women are made absolutely equal, both in the image of God. And that was the core animating principle at the heart of her work, and it became this extraordinary heartbeat of the wider women's movement in the British context. It wasn't the only beat of the women's movement, but it was a very formative one. I want to bring out one practice, and then I'll sort of stop talking. She went to Cambridge finally in 1879. She would have loved to have gone to Cambridge. She was involved in campaigning for women's higher education for a very long time. When she got there, she got to speak to young men. And she was down to teach young men about sexual purity. And she says something so extraordinary. She says, if you want one piece of advice, go to your room, shut the door, and learn how to be alone with God. And she makes this argument in this text, which is such an extraordinary piece, where she basically argues that the only way that culture can really change is when human beings learn what justice is by spending time with the only one who is just. And getting their bearings, not from the newspapers and the sayings of culture, but getting their bearings from Christ of Scripture. And right at the heart of Josephine's work is this commitment that she lives by throughout her life, right till she's living in one room of her son's house, to spend at least 1 hour every single day on her own with God. And this is the piece of advice she gives to these future leaders of the nation. If there's one thing you need to learn to do when you're young, it's how to spend time alone with God. And they didn't even have phones in those days. And she still describes the act of going and being alone as an act of positive heroism. It takes courage to be alone. And there's an amazing description of what kind of courage it takes to wrestle your way into solitude, to be alone with God. So you remember that apron last week over the head? Susanna Wesley, that apron, and she could be alone with God. But Josephine Butler, was that hour a day that she spent. And right at the heart of the campaign, height of the campaign, somebody asked her, how on earth do you manage to spend an hour alone every day? And she looked at them with a kind of perplexed look and said, it's my sweet rest. It's a lovely phrase. She calls that her hour of sweet rest, being in the presence of God. Most leaders peak and flake. The most extraordinary writings, the mystical writings of Butler's life, Christian mysticism, her deep reflections on prayer, happened, I think, the absolute gold of this woman's life is in the bits that no biographers ever want to write about. When she was barely able to walk as an elderly woman, and she writes the most sublime letters and small reflections on intimacy with God and the very nature of prayer. And they are so beautiful. So she's an unusual woman because she does literally go from strength to strength. So much more I can tell you about her, but I want to stop there so that there's time if anybody wants to ask a question and take us in a different direction. I know that Lois already loves Josephine Butler. She gets under your skin, doesn't she?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I first read about her when I was a teenager. And I can't remember where or why, to be perfectly honest. But and it's always been difficult to find anything out about her. I mean, with the internet now, you can find a bit more, but it was very difficult. But she was always sort of there in the background somewhere. I was always aware of her, yeah.
We do need heroes, don't we? Or heroines, I don't know whether we can feminise that. But we need people that we can be inspired with. And our culture's really good at tearing people down. And we've had this amazing example, haven't we, in the last week, of how beautiful it is to celebrate a life that is truly inspiring. How it draws people together instead of pulling them apart. And we are so good as a culture of just pulling down anybody who does anything almost. And we need people to inspire us. And the thing that's been so impactful for me is that this woman inspires me. Not only because of what she did in her actual political engagement, but just her depth, her love, her humanity, and it's moved me. It's changed my lens on life. I want to live differently after reading about her, and I think that we're meant to have heroes like that help us to keep running the race in faith, like it says in the book of Hebrews. so that we persevere when things are really tough, so that we don't give up hope, so that we don't grow weary of doing good. And Philippa.
So when she died, I'm just thinking about it. When she died, what sort of recognition did she have at that time, and what happened? I mean, do you know what happened afterwards that it did sort of fall away?
There are different ways of answering your question. So by the time she dies in 1906, she's living up in Northumberland with one of her sons. She moves out of the public eye in terms of her actual sort of face-to-face engagement with people from about 1898. And she begins to relinquish her responsibilities much earlier than that, really, certainly by 1890. And as she begins to change the focus of her work, she focuses in, as often strategic people do, on mentoring younger women. And she's very selective, she's very deliberate. So she cuts back on her travelling and she focuses in. And some of those most extraordinary writings on prayer are in a correspondence with a young woman called Miss Forsyth. And she continues to correspond with her right until the end of her life. So so these strategic women who are going to go on to be leaders in their own right, actually Millicent Fawcett is one of them, she's going to have a deep, deep impact on them. But by the time she actually dies, people are beginning to forget who she was, as often happens if you have a long life and you go out of the public gaze and you've done something. So everybody remembers the drama of the Contagious Diseases Acts, and they remember a little bit about her, but she's beginning to get a bit fuzzy in people's memories. When Millicent Fawcett and some of these women that she's mentored begin to take up really prominent leadership roles, they rehabilitate her memory and say, we owe everything we are to her. We need to learn about her. But it's very much, in that sense, a little bit of oral tradition. However, Millicent Fawcett believes that Josephine Butler was one of the instrumental figures in designing the architecture of what would become the League of Nations. And there is a very strong historical argument for that. So she's still remembered, but it's a little bit fuzzy. And as that generation dies, there are no biographies of her until the one that I suspect you read, actually, which is Mobley Bell's Flame.
I still remember where I read about her. I really don't.
Yeah. And that was written in the 1960s, but actually nobody really wrote about her. Her grave is just very obscure. She was hardly known. She was hardly known at the end. Yes.
So can I ask a couple of questions about the men in her life?
Yes. And they are very important.
I did read something, it was a chapter in a book a long time ago, but two things I seem to remember, I wonder if you think they're right, that she shared her vision, I think for crusading against the Contagious Diseases Act, with her husband, and he was supportive. Secondly, this article, whatever it was, suggested that she had more support among working class men than among middle class, because they were the ones whose sisters and daughters were, being exploited. And a third one, just to speculate, did Gladstone support her at all? Because he had concern, for fallen women. And I just wonder where he stood in her campaign.
I wrote a footnote about Gladstone today, so I'm glad you asked me. That makes me feel, it appeals to my sensibility. The men in her life really are incredibly significant. And the information we have about Butler's inner life is very carefully hidden away in a biography about her father, John Gray of Dilston, and then another extraordinary biography written in 1892 about her husband George. So the feminists don't like that about Josephine Butler. Women shouldn't refract their identities through their men figures. Josephine doesn't even have remote problem with that. Not even remote problem. And she has deep, sustaining relationships. She works with men. James Stansfeld would be a good example. William Fowler, who led the parliamentary campaign. She had very rich, deep relationships with men, male colleagues, throughout her life. She also writes in extraordinary ways in these two biographies about the beauty of men who are pure. So she contrasts her attack on the duplicity and hypocrisy of sexual immorality with the purity of a life devoted to Christ, male and female. And that's a really important dynamic of her writing. It's something I want to tried to bring out in my book, because it's very unpopular in a lot of the literature about Josephine Butler. The point about working class men, absolutely, they really worked closely with her. They were the backbone of the communities of practice. And when she went to stand before the Royal Commission in 1871, she filled her pockets with letters from the men of Rochdale and Darlington, who wrote letters to her to express their deep concerns about the Contagious Diseases Act and their worries, not just for their daughters, but for their sons, and for the ways that these acts will lead them into lives of engaging in prostitution. And so she does what wasn't typical in those days. In 1871, she gets these letters out, and she says, now you're going to listen to these men, in front of the 25 learned men of the Royal Commission. And so they're very important to her. And then the point about Gladstone is really, really interesting, because he did have a personal interest in rescuing prostitutes. That was quite a normal thing for lots of people to be engaged with. But the issue of individually reclaiming one prostitute is very different from dealing with this systemic exploitation of women, the systemic issues of prostitution, and specifically its relationship with the military lobby. And Gladstone had every opportunity in his first administration between 1868 and 1874 to bring in a quick repeal of the Contagious Diseases Act. It would have been consistent with his liberalism to do so. Major tenet of liberalism: defend the rights and liberties of individuals. Contagious Diseases Acts violated the rights of individuals. It was a liberal violation. And Butler attacks it on liberal grounds. So Gladstone's failure to act is very curious. And historians have found that to be something of a conundrum. He, I think, this is the argument that I would make, he's right involved with Cardwell's army reforms. They're brought in 1868, and over the period of the first Gladstone administration, they are overhauling the efficiency of the army. And Gladstone has made that one of his electoral tenets. We're going to reform the army. And the military lobby is so strong, and it's so in favour of the Contagious Diseases Act, that Gladstone really, for his own political survival, and he is a pragmatist at the end of the day, he can't afford to lose their support in the House of Commons. So I think that's why he doesn't repeal. Why he doesn't repeal later? Well, eventually he does, in 1886. But it takes a very, very long time, and he always comes up with the excuse, well, I'm dealing with Home Rule in Ireland. Well, I'm dealing with army reform. Oh, no, Afghanistan, we've got to send troops. We can't do anything. Oh, no, there's a revolt in Abyssinia. And he would write letters to Josephine Butler giving all these good reasons why he'd never got round to this issue. And she just kept hounding him. So why he didn't, I don't know. He was a strange and curious man.